disappeared on January 13th.
I had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of Hae.
We took every single piece and took it apart, put it back together. And we're very confident in the jury's decision back in 2000.
In February of 2022, forensic scientists tested a pair of black dress shoes recovered from a 1999 crime scene. They found DNA from at least 4 unknown men. Neither the convicted defendant nor the state's key witness matched any of these profiles. The prosecutor called it exculpatory evidence and asked the judge to vacate the conviction. 3 years later, a different prosecutor called the same DNA evidence meaningless and asked to reinstate that conviction. Both prosecutors were looking at identical lab results. So what changed? This is a documentary about evidence as a process, not a story about guilt or innocence. We're going to dissect 4 pieces of forensic evidence from the Adnan Syed case, and by the end, you will understand why the same physical evidence can tell radically different stories depending on who's reading it and when they're reading it. The DNA profiles, the cell tower data, the alternative suspects, and the timeline construction. 4 evidence mysteries that reveal how forensic science works in practice, not in theory. Here's what you need to know. On January 13th, 1999, 18-year-old Hae Min Lee disappeared from a Baltimore high school. Her body was found 6 weeks later in Leakin Park. Medical examiners determined she died from manual strangulation. 6 weeks after that, police arrested her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, then 17 years old. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from Jay Wilds, an acquaintance who said he helped Syed bury Lee's body. In 2000, a jury convicted Syed of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For 23 years, Syed maintained his innocence while his case generated unprecedented public attention. Then in 2022, Baltimore prosecutors filed a motion to vacate his conviction, citing new DNA evidence and undisclosed information about alternative suspects.
Once again, through our review, our investigation uncovered that one of the suspects threatened Miss Lee, saying he would make her disappear. He would kill her.
A judge granted the motion. Syed walked free. But in 2025, a different prosecutor filed a motion to withdraw the vacatur, arguing the 2022 analysis was flawed. As of today, the legal status remains unresolved. We're not here to retry the case. We're here to understand what the evidence actually shows, what it doesn't show, and why qualified experts can look at the same data and reach opposite conclusions. Let's start with the DNA. On February 28, 1999, investigators recovered Hae Min Lee's black dress shoes from her car. Those shoes sat in evidence storage for 23 years. In 2022, the Baltimore State Attorney's Office ordered new DNA testing using a methodology called YSTR analysis. This technique specifically targets the Y chromosome, which exists only in biological males, making it useful for detecting male DNA even in mixed samples or degraded evidence. The lab found DNA from at least 4 unknown male contributors on those shoes. Let's be precise about what that means scientifically. The testing excluded Adnan Syed, as a contributor to any of these profiles. The testing also excluded JWowws. Those exclusions are scientifically robust. When YSTR testing excludes someone, it means their DNA is definitively not present in that sample. There's no ambiguity there. The 2022 prosecutor argued this was exculpatory evidence. The logic went like this. If the victim's shoes contained DNA from multiple unknown men, and if those shoes were on her feet during the crime, then unknown individuals had contact with the victim in circumstances that could transfer DNA. That contact could be relevant to understanding what happened. The 2025 prosecutor argued the opposite. The DNA is meaningless touch DNA that could have been deposited anywhere, anytime, by anyone. Someone who brushed past her in a crowded hallway. Someone who touched the shoes in a store before she bought them. Someone who handled the shoes during evidence collection. The prosecutor pointed out that the state never argued Syed acted alone, so the presence of unknown DNA doesn't contradict the prosecution theory. Both positions are scientifically defensible. That's the first thing you need to understand about forensic DNA evidence. The science of exclusion is rock solid, but the science of attribution, figuring out how and when DNA got where it is, remains interpretive. Let's dig deeper into what YSTR testing can and cannot tell us. The methodology is excellent at detecting male DNA in scenarios where female DNA predominates or where samples are degraded. It's less informative than standard autosomal DNA testing in one critical way. YSTR profiles are inherited patrilineally. That means all male relatives in a direct paternal line share the same YSTR profile. A father, son, brother, uncle, and male cousin on the father's side would be indistinguishable using this method. So when we say at least 4 unknown male profiles, we mean at least 4 separate paternal lineages, not necessarily 4 individual men. The testing also cannot tell us when the DNA was deposited. DNA degrades over time, but that degradation depends on environmental conditions. DNA can persist on fabric for days, weeks, months, or even years, depending on storage conditions, moisture, temperature, and UV exposure. Shoes stored in a car trunk in winter, then in an evidence locker for 23 years, create unusual preservation conditions. No forensic scientist can give you a precise timeline for when DNA was transferred based solely on its presence. And here's where interpretation becomes critical. Touch DNA transfers during casual contact. You touch a doorknob, you leave DNA. Someone shakes your hand, they pick up your DNA. Most of us shed DNA constantly through skin cells. So the question becomes, what kind of contact does the presence of DNA on shoes suggest? The 2022 motion emphasized that these were the victim's shoes recovered from her car, presumably the shoes she was wearing near the time of her death. If someone's DNA is on those shoes, that person had some form of contact with either the shoes or the victim. The motion argued that, at minimum, this evidence should have been available to the defense in 1999. The jury might have weighed this information differently. They might have had reasonable doubt. The 2025 motion took a different approach. It argued that touch DNA on shoes is exactly the kind of trace evidence that forensic scientists now recognize as having limited probative value. The National Academy of Sciences published a major report in 2009 criticizing the overconfidence of forensic evidence interpretation. That report specifically warned about the difficulty of determining the timing and circumstances of DNA transfer. By this reasoning, the DNA profiles don't exculpate anyone because they don't tell us anything meaningful about the crime itself. Who's right? Both prosecutors are citing legitimate scientific principles. The disagreement isn't about the lab work. The lab work is solid. The disagreement is about what the lab work means in context. And that's not a scientific question anymore. That's a question of judgment, probability, and reasonable inference. Consider the baseline probability problem. How much DNA would you expect to find on a pair of shoes worn by a high school student? Probably quite a bit. She walks through hallways. She rides in cars. Friends lean against her. People bump into her in crowds. Some unknown DNA on her shoes is utterly expected. But 4 separate male profiles? That's where the probability assessment becomes genuinely difficult. Is 4 a lot? Is it normal? Is it suspicious? We don't have good baseline data for comparison. Here's what makes this evidence powerful to some observers and meaningless to others. Powerful. Multiple unknown male DNA profiles on the victim's shoes. Neither the convicted defendant nor the key witness matches. The presence of this DNA was never explained at trial, and the defense never had the opportunity to investigate these unknown contributors. Meaningless. Touch DNA transfers easily. We can't date the transfer. We can't link the transfer to the crime. And the state's theory never required Syed to have touched the victim's shoes. The DNA evidence shows us something important about how forensic science evolves. The lab techniques available in 1999 were limited. Testing consumed evidence samples. DNA analysis was expensive. Prosecutors made strategic choices about what to test based on available technology and resources. By 2022, YSTR testing was routine, more sensitive, and less destructive. Evidence that couldn't be tested in 1999 became testable. But that doesn't automatically mean the new results change the calculus of guilt or innocence. They just give us more information, and more information doesn't always mean more clarity. Now, let's examine the cell tower evidence. This is where forensic science intersects with engineering, and where confident trial testimony collides with scientific limitations. On January 13, 1999, 2 incoming calls were received on a cell phone registered to Adnan Syed. Those calls came in at 7:09 p.m. and 7:16 p.m. According to records from AT&T Wireless, both calls connected through a cell tower designated L689B. That tower is located near Leakin Park, where Hae Min Lee's body was found 6 weeks later. The prosecution argued these calls placed Syed's phone in Leakin Park during the burial. At trial, the state called Abraham Woranowitz, a radio frequency engineer, as an expert witness. Woranowitz testified that based on the cell tower data, the phone was in the coverage area of Tower L689B when those calls were received. He demonstrated this through drive tests, physically visiting locations and checking which towers the phone connected to. His testimony was detailed, technical, and confident. The jury heard expert testimony that the phone was where the prosecution said it was, when the prosecution said it was there. 16 years later, Woranowitz signed an affidavit changing his position. He stated that he was not shown an AT&T subscriber activity report fax cover sheet during his trial preparation. That cover sheet contained a disclaimer. The disclaimer read, in part, that incoming calls are not reliable for determining location. Woranowitz wrote that if he had seen this disclaimer, he would not have testified as he did. He would not have affirmed the reliability of using incoming call data for location tracking. Let's unpack why this matters technically. Cell towers don't work like GPS. When you make an outgoing call, your phone searches for available towers and typically connects to the nearest one with the strongest signal. That's reasonably predictive of location, though not perfectly so. Signal strength varies with terrain, buildings, weather, and network traffic. But it's a decent approximation. Incoming calls work differently. When someone calls you, the network routes that call to your phone through whichever tower is most efficient for the network at that moment. That might be the nearest tower. It might not be. The network optimizes for capacity and load balancing, not for creating a precise location record of where you are. The tower that handles your incoming call tells you which tower the network used. It doesn't necessarily tell you where you were. AT&T included that disclaimer on subscriber reports because they understood this technical limitation. The network engineering team knew that incoming call data was not designed for location tracking. Law enforcement was using this data for investigative purposes, and AT&T wanted to flag the limitation. But that disclaimer was on a fax cover sheet. It wasn't on every page of the call records. It was easy to miss. The question becomes, how much does this technical limitation matter in practice? The 2016 defense argument was straightforward. If incoming calls are unreliable for location, and if the two key calls placing Syed in Leakin Park were both incoming calls, then the scientific foundation for that location evidence collapses. Without the cell tower data placing Syed in the park during the burial window, the prosecution timeline has a major gap. The counter-argument is more technical. While incoming calls are less reliable than outgoing calls, they are not completely random. The phone has to be somewhere within the coverage area of that tower. Tower L689B covers Leakin Park, but it also covers other areas. So the incoming calls tell us the phone was somewhere in that broader coverage zone. That's still probative. It's just less precise than the prosecution presented it at trial. Here's where expert disagreement becomes a jury problem. Imagine you're a juror in 1999. You hear an engineer testify confidently that the phone was in Leakin Park. You hear drive test results. You see maps. The expert seems credible, qualified, and certain. How are you supposed to know that incoming calls have reliability limitations? How are you supposed to know about the disclaimer that even the expert didn't see? You're being asked to trust expertise, but the expertise was incomplete. This reveals something about how technical evidence functions in trials. Jurors can't independently verify radio frequency engineering principles. They're dependent on expert interpretation. When that interpretation changes because new information comes to light, it doesn't mean anyone lied. It means the adversarial system failed to surface critical information that would have allowed for complete analysis. The cell tower evidence also shows us how scientific standards evolve. In 1999, law enforcement regularly used cell tower data for location tracking. Courts admitted this evidence. Experts testified to its reliability. But by 2016, both the scientific community and the legal community had developed more sophisticated understanding of the limitations. The National Institute of Standards and Technology issued guidance on cell site analysis. Academic researchers published studies showing the imprecision of location estimates based on tower connections. What seemed reliable in 1999 looked questionable in 2016. The timeline reconstruction becomes even more complex when we consider that Jay Wilds, the key prosecution witness, gave multiple different accounts of the burial time frame. In some versions, the burial happened around 7 p.m. In others, it happened closer to midnight. The cell tower data seemed to corroborate the 7 p.m. version, which became the prosecution timeline. But if incoming calls aren't reliable location indicators, then the cell data doesn't corroborate anything definitively. It just shows the phone connected through a tower whose coverage area includes multiple locations. Does this mean the cell tower evidence is worthless? Not exactly. It means the cell tower evidence is less precise than it was presented to be. The phone was somewhere. That somewhere is constrained by tower coverage. But the exact location within that coverage area remains uncertain. And for a prosecution theory, that requires the defendant to be in a specific park at a specific time. That uncertainty matters. Now let's turn to the alternative suspects. This is where we move from scientific evidence to investigative documentation, and where transparency becomes the central issue. The 2022 motion to vacate referenced information about two alternative suspects known to police in 1999. According to the motion, one of these individuals had threatened Hae Min Lee. Another had relevant information about vehicle locations. The motion argued that this information was never disclosed to the defense, representing a Brady violation. Brady v. Maryland established that prosecutors must disclose evidence favorable to the defense. The failure to disclose information about alternative suspects, if that information is exculpatory, is a constitutional violation. The 2025 motion to withdraw the vacatur called this characterization false and misleading. The newer prosecutor argued that the 2022 motion misrepresented what the police actually knew and when they knew it. According to the 2025 filing, the alternative suspect information was either not credible, not timely, or non-material to the defense. Here's the problem. The underlying police reports and investigative documents have never been publicly released. We know there were two individuals. We know police had some information about them. We know the 2022 prosecutor thought that information should have been disclosed. We know the 2025 prosecutor disagreed, but we don't know what the actual documents say. This creates an evidence assessment problem. How do you evaluate whether a Brady violation occurred when you can't see the evidence in question? The defense can't independently verify the 2022 prosecutor's characterization. The public can't verify the 2025 prosecutor's rebuttal. We're left with competing assertions about sealed materials. What we can say is this. In any murder investigation, police generate information about multiple potential suspects. Some of that information leads nowhere. Some of it gets ruled out through investigation. Some of it remains unexplained. The question is, what rises to the level of materiality that requires disclosure? Let's consider what materiality means in this context. If police knew that another individual had threatened the victim, that's potentially material. Threat information suggests motive, means, an opportunity for someone other than the defendant. But materiality also depends on the credibility and specificity of the threat. If the threat was vague, if it occurred months before the crime, if the threatening individual had a solid alibi, then maybe it's not material. We don't know these details. Similarly, if police knew about vehicle location information connecting another individual to relevant locations, that's potentially material. But again, it depends on the specifics. What locations? What time frame? How reliable is the information? Was it investigated and ruled out? The alternative suspect issue shows us how prosecutorial discretion functions in practice. Prosecutors make judgment calls about what evidence is exculpatory. They make judgment calls about what must be disclosed. Those judgments are supposed to err on the side of disclosure. But in practice, prosecutors often take a narrower view of their obligations. They disclose what they think meets the legal standard. Defense attorneys can't challenge non-disclosure of evidence they don't know exists. This is why the Brady doctrine remains controversial. The system depends on prosecutors policing themselves. If a prosecutor decides certain information is immaterial, the defense has limited recourse unless and until someone else reviews the case file and reaches a different conclusion. That's what happened here. A new prosecutor in 2022 reviewed the case file and concluded that material information had not been disclosed. An even newer prosecutor in 2025 reviewed the same file and concluded the opposite. Who's right? Without access to the underlying documents, we can't make an independent assessment. But the existence of this dispute tells us something important about how evidence disclosure works. It's not a clear-cut scientific process. It's a judgment call influenced by the reviewer's interpretation of what matters, what's credible, and what a reasonable defense attorney would have wanted to know. Finally, Let's examine how the prosecution timeline was constructed and why timeline construction matters for evidence interpretation. The state's theory required two critical time windows. First, the murder window. School ended at 2:15 p.m. Hae Min Lee had to pick up her cousin at 3:15 p.m. She never arrived. Somewhere in that 1 hour window, the prosecution argued Adnan Syed got into Lee's car, drove to a location, and killed her. Second, the burial window. Based on cell tower records and Jay Wilde's testimony, the prosecution placed the burial around 7 to 8 p.m. the same evening. Let's start with the murder window. The prosecution argued Syed asked Lee for a ride that morning. Multiple students heard this request. Lee initially agreed, then later told another student she couldn't give him a ride because something came up. The prosecution theory required Syed to nonetheless get into Lee's car between 2:15 and 3:15 p.m., drive to a secondary location, commit the murder, and then meet up with Jay Wilde as planned. The defense argued this timeline was physically impossible. Syed was seen in the school library at 2:36 p.m. A witness, Asia McLean, said she spoke with him there. If Syed was in the library at 2:36, and if Lee needed to leave campus by 2:40 to reach her cousin by 3:15, then the window for Syed to intercept Lee, drive somewhere, and commit murder shrinks to roughly 15 to 20 minutes. The defense argued you can't reconstruct a sequence of events that fits. The prosecution responded that the exact timing was uncertain. Maybe Lee left campus a few minutes later. Maybe the library sighting was a few minutes earlier. Maybe Asia McLean was mistaken about the time. When you're reconstructing events from witness memories weeks or months after the fact, some imprecision is inevitable. The core timeline, leaving campus after school and before 3:15, remains sound even if you can't pinpoint every minute. This is what I mean by assumption stacking. To accept the prosecution timeline, you have to accept a series of assumptions. Assume the library sighting was early or misremembered. Assume Lee left campus on the later end of the possible departure window. Assume the drive to the murder location was quick. Assume the murder itself took less time than you might expect. Each individual assumption might be reasonable, but stack enough assumptions together, and the cumulative probability starts to feel strained. Now, consider the burial window. The prosecution timeline placed the burial around 7 to 8 p.m. based primarily on the cell tower data and Jay Wilde's testimony. But as we discussed, the cell tower data has reliability problems, and Jay Wilde gave multiple different accounts of when the burial occurred. In his first police interview, he described the burial happening closer to midnight. In later statements, he moved the time earlier to align with the cell records. This creates a circularity problem. The cell evidence seems to corroborate Jay's timeline, but Jay's timeline shifted to match the cell evidence. So are they independent corroboration, or is one simply conforming to the other? When a witness's story changes to align with evidence shown to them by investigators, that alignment loses probative value. You can't use the evidence to verify the testimony if the testimony was shaped by the evidence. The defense offered an alternative timeline. Maybe Lee left campus and went somewhere else before encountering her attacker. Maybe the murder occurred later in the afternoon or early evening. Maybe the burial happened much later than 7 p.m. This alternative timeline would explain why students saw Lee leave campus alone. It would explain why Adnan Syed's alibi witnesses place him elsewhere in the critical hours after school. But this alternative timeline has its own assumption stack. It requires explaining where Lee went, why she went there, and who she encountered. Here's why timeline construction matters for evidence interpretation. Every piece of evidence we've discussed, the DNA, the cell towers, the alternative suspects, gets interpreted within a timeline framework. If you believe the murder happened between 2:15 and 3:15 p.m., then DNA evidence from that morning or afternoon feels more relevant. If you believe the burial happened around 7 p.m., then cell tower data from 7:09 feels more probative. But if the timeline itself is constructed from assumptions, then all the evidence interpreted through that timeline inherits those assumptions. Think of it like building a house. The timeline is the foundation. Everything else sits on top. If the foundation has cracks, stress transfers to everything built on it. That doesn't mean the house falls down. It means you have to constantly check whether the weight-bearing assumptions still hold. The timeline also reveals how narratives crystallize during investigation. Early in an investigation, everything is uncertain. You have fragments of information, witness statements, physical evidence, and lots of unknowns. Gradually, investigators construct a theory that organizes these fragments into a coherent story. That story becomes a framework for interpreting new evidence. But once the narrative crystallizes, there's a psychological tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence as consistent with the existing theory. This is confirmation bias, and it affects everyone, not just police or prosecutors. By trial, the timeline had fully crystallized. The prosecution presented a detailed sequence of events. The defense challenged pieces of that sequence, but struggled to offer an equally detailed alternative. Jurors tend to prefer detailed narratives over expressions of uncertainty. Saying we don't know exactly when feels weaker than saying it happened at 2:36 p.m. But certainty in the narrative doesn't equal accuracy in the reconstruction. So what does all this evidence tell us when we step back and look at it holistically? The DNA evidence definitively excludes Adnan Syed and Jay Wiles from the profiles found on the victim's shoes. That exclusion is scientifically solid. But the significance of that exclusion depends entirely on what you think the DNA represents. Unknown touch DNA with no timeline attribution? Probably meaningless. Unknown DNA from individuals with potential connection to the crime? Potentially important. The cell tower evidence places the phone in the coverage area of a tower near Leakin Park during the burial window. But the precision of that placement is questionable. The expert who testified at trial later said he wouldn't have testified the same way if he'd known about the disclaimer regarding incoming calls. That doesn't make the evidence worthless, but it makes it much less definitive than it appeared to the jury. The alternative suspect information exists in a documentation black hole. We know police had information. We know one prosecutor thought it should have been disclosed. We know another prosecutor disagreed. Without access to the underlying documents, we can't independently assess who's right. The timeline reconstruction rests on a foundation of stacked assumptions. Some of those assumptions are reasonable. Some are necessary given the passage of time and the limits of memory. But the cumulative uncertainty makes the timeline more fragile than it appeared at trial. Now here's the critical question. If you were an expert asked to rank these 4 evidence pieces by strength, how would you order them? There's no objectively correct answer, and that's precisely the point. Different experts weight different factors. Some prioritize scientific rigor and would rank the DNA evidence highest because the lab work is unimpeachable. Others prioritize investigative context and would rank the DNA evidence lowest because touch DNA is ubiquitous. Some experts trust engineering testimony and would give significant weight to the cell tower data. Others focus on the disclaimer and would discount it heavily. This is the expert disagreement problem, and is not unique to this case. Forensic evidence interpretation involves judgment. Yes, the science provides constraints. You can't just make up whatever you want. But within the boundaries of scientific validity, there's room for interpretive disagreement. And when experts disagree, jurors have to choose. They're not choosing between science and pseudoscience. They're choosing between competing interpretations of legitimate scientific data. Let's zoom out further. What does this case reveal about forensic evidence generally? First, it reveals that forensic science evolves. Techniques improve. Standards change. What was considered best practice in 1999 looks inadequate by 2022 standards. This creates a fundamental challenge for the justice system. Do we hold past cases to past standards or current standards? If we apply current standards retroactively, thousands of convictions become questionable. If we don't, we're knowingly accepting that people were convicted based on evidence we now recognize as flawed. Second, it reveals the gap between scientific certainty and legal certainty. Science deals in probabilities, error rates, and confidence intervals. Law deals in proof beyond reasonable doubt. Those are different standards, and they don't always translate cleanly. An expert can say we're 95% confident this DNA came from contact within 72 hours. But what does 95% confidence mean to a juror trying to decide if the state has proven its case beyond reasonable doubt? These are different epistemological frameworks. Third, it reveals how documentation and disclosure practices matter enormously. The alternative suspect issue exists because we don't know what's in the file. The cell tower issue exists partly because a disclaimer was on a cover sheet rather than integrated into the expert's analysis. When critical information is buried, forgotten, or never disclosed, the adversarial system can't function properly. The defense can't challenge evidence they don't know exists. Fourth, it reveals that evidence interpretation is always contextual. The same DNA profile means different things depending on your theory of the case. The same cell tower record means different things depending on your understanding of how cellular networks route calls. Evidence doesn't interpret itself. Human judgment interprets evidence, and human judgment is shaped by assumptions, experiences, and cognitive biases. This brings us back to where we started. Two prosecutors looked at the same DNA evidence. One called it exculpatory, one called it meaningless. Both were making reasonable interpretive judgments within the bounds of scientific validity. The disagreement isn't a failure of science. It's an illustration of how science works in practice. Data is objective. Interpretation is not. So, what do we conclude about the DNA profile found on the victim's shoes? We conclude that it excludes Adnan Syed and Jay Wilds. We conclude that it represents at least 4 unknown male DNA contributors. We conclude that we cannot determine when that DNA was deposited or under what circumstances. We conclude that reasonable experts can disagree about whether this evidence has probative value regarding guilt or innocence. And here's what that tells us about evidence more broadly. Evidence is not a static thing you find and present. Evidence is a process. It's a process of collection, testing, interpretation, and reinterpretation. The process changes as technology improves. It changes as scientific understanding deepens. It changes as different people with different perspectives review the same data. Hae Min Lee deserves justice. Adnan Syed deserves a fair trial with full access to all relevant evidence. Jay Wilds deserves not to be vilified based on incomplete information. These are real people whose lives were irrevocably altered by what happened on January 13th, 1999. The evidence we've dissected isn't abstract. It's supposed to serve justice for all of them. But here's the uncomfortable truth this case forces us to confront. Our justice system asks ordinary people to make extraordinary judgments based on complex evidence they're not equipped to fully evaluate. We ask jurors to adjudicate expert disagreements. We ask them to assess the reliability of cellular network engineering. We ask them to weigh touch DNA transfer probabilities. We ask them to do this under time pressure, with limited information, and with the weight of someone's life in their hands. Maybe the system works well enough most of the time. Maybe the adversarial process surfaces enough truth. But cases like this one reveal the stress points. when experts disagree, when evidence changes meaning with new technology, when critical information wasn't disclosed, when timeline assumptions stack too high. These stress points don't resolve themselves. They require human judgment, and human judgment is fallible. The 4 evidence mysteries we started with remain mysteries. The DNA profiles tell us something, but we disagree about what. The cell tower data places the phone somewhere, but we disagree about how precisely. The alternative suspects exist in the file, but we disagree about what that means. The timeline hangs together if you accept enough assumptions, but we disagree about whether those assumptions are reasonable. Evidence is process. Justice is judgment. And sometimes, even when everyone is trying their best, the process doesn't produce the clarity we desperately want it to produce. That's not a satisfying conclusion, but it's an honest one. And in a documentary about evidence, honesty matters more than satisfaction.